One question I often get asked when I'm talking about my work with family members or other friends who are not academics is they'll say, I never liked history at school, or I don't have a memory for dates. And I think there is this sense of history as a field, as a discipline, as it's taught in schools around the world, which does have to do with often a very dry sequence of events. The way I'm drawn to history is as something really quite different from that. We're used to thinking about the histories of different countries really quite separate from one another. We study Indian history, we study Malaysian history, we study the history of the United States. And if there's one thread, one theme that brings all of my work together, it is that we need to think about how our histories are linked. And they're linked in ways that we often forget. I came to the history of public health in South Asia through a broader interest in development as an idea. The idea that in so many parts of the world, and above all in India in the middle of the 20th century, there were such hopes for a better future that would come from the end of colonialism, that would come with independence. And health seemed to me a particularly interesting subject through which to study politics, through which to study all that changed and perhaps what didn't change in 1947. Health is also a very interesting way to study movement. If you think about infectious diseases like malaria, like cholera, like plague, they follow the railway lines, they follow the shipping lines, they track the migration, the mobility of people. The more I thought about it, the more I thought, however, that migration in and of itself would be a fascinating subject to study, particularly that large amount of migration that links India with Southeast Asia. Why India and Southeast Asia? I think first and foremost because those two regions are intensively connected in a way that India is not connected with any other part of the world. That is to say, the sheer scale of movement of migration between India and Southeast Asia starting in the middle of the 19th century, but in fact on a small scale going back to ancient times. Partly it's a question of proximity. India and Southeast Asia share a neighborhood, they share the Bay of Bengal, and the coastal regions of that world, I think, are very densely interconnected. I think that does provide us with a very different perspective on history from that which focuses on superpowers or which even just focuses on nation states, because this is a perspective of life as it is lived. This is life as it is experienced by migrant laborers who don't necessarily just make one journey, but who move back and forth between destinations overseas and their homes, in this case, mostly their homes in Tamil Nadu. Environmental history is the study of human interactions with and impacts on the rest of nature, upon the environment over either short or long spans of time. So some environmental history is over thousands of years in terms of how humans have transformed the earth. The kind of environmental history I do is much more modern environmental history, but it is about how the environment in the sense of climate and landscape shapes human choices and human societies, but also the other way around, how human activity has transformed landscapes, has reshaped environments. In that sense, the relationship between environmental history and the history of migration is absolutely crucial. Those are very closely linked phenomena. There is a very clear relationship between particular episodes of natural disaster that you see in parts of South India and an upturn in migration to places like Sri Lanka, to Burma, to Malaysia. Natural disasters may cause people to seek security elsewhere, but it is only the human institutions that make migration possible, that mean that certain parts of migration are open to people while others are not. So that interaction between thinking about the environment, thinking about the impact that nature might have on the choices that people make, but also thinking about the human institutions that provide or cut off particular solutions to that, is at the heart of the kind of interest that I have. Also interested in the other side of that relationship, which is to say, what are the environmental consequences of large-scale migration? And those consequences are very profound. If we think about the physical effects of that large-scale movement of labor between India and Southeast Asia in the 19th century, it was a total transformation of the landscape of Southeast Asia. I really cannot imagine a world without migration. And yet, all around us, I think people do imagine a world without migration. If one listens to the sort of political rhetoric one has heard in so many different parts of the world over the last couple of years, it is often a profoundly nostalgic view for a past without migration. One hears politicians essentially suggest that in those days our communities were whole and homogeneous, and there were not these outsiders who are challenging our way of life or who are threatening us. As a historian, indeed as a citizen, there is no country that I know which has not been very profoundly shaped by migration. The problem is that those histories of migration, going back to what we were saying earlier, those histories of migration have very often been erased from public memory. To the very extent that we are encouraged so much to think in terms of national histories, in terms of official histories, we forget how many families, how many communities around the world, either in the recent past or in the distant past, have had their trajectories shaped by movement. The Infosys Prize is a deep honor to me. One of the many things I'm particularly humbled by is to join a list of winners that includes so many winners this year and in past years whose work I really deeply admire. The prize gives me the freedom to devote more time and energy to my current work, which is on environmental history, which is particularly on the environmental history of water in modern India and Southeast Asia. And it gives me the inspiration to continue to look to history as a way to address urgent contemporary problems.